My mother demanded I pay for my sister's wedding. She said it over the phone in a tone that sounded casual, like asking me to pick up milk on the way home. It was March 14th, 2024. She told me the total, $37,500. She told me the deadline, 2 weeks. She told me why it mattered, because it would be embarrassing if they had to downgrade the venue. And she told me finally that it had always been assumed I would cover things like this. "We've been helping you," she said, and that phrase landed like a hand on the back of my neck. It hurt because there was no discussion, no question of what I could actually afford, and no memory of the decades I had spent keeping the house afloat. It hurt because it came from the person who had taught me, ever since I was small, that family meant mutual responsibility. And it hurt because I had been the one doing unpaid labor in that family for years, the late night medication charts for my father, the grocery runs, the tax returns done with cheap software, the quiet edits to the forms my mother said she handled. For her to place a number on top of that and demand it like a bill, without acknowledging anything I had already given, felt like theft of a different kind. We didn't talk about my half sentence of protest on the call. She reassured me, then hung up. The next morning she texted a breakdown of costs. Venue, $15,000, photographer, $4,200, catering deposit, $9,300, dress and alterations, $3,000, rehearsal dinner, $2,000, unspecified contingency, $4,000. The contingency line was circled, as if that made it reasonable. I had a job. I'd been working as a junior paralegal at a small firm for 5 years. Bringing home $38,000 a year after taxes. I had savings, but not that kind of savings. I had, in the 2 previous years, covered my father's co-pays and dental work when the insurance skipped a beat. I had paid for the winter heating oil 1 year when Mum refused to call the landlord. I paid the electric and Wi-Fi on a rotating schedule because Mum said she couldn't be bothered to deal with online portals. When I added up the money I'd quietly moved into the household account over the last 3 years, the figure looked like someone else's mortgage, $21,600. I had receipts in my bank history, $500 auto pay transfers, cash withdrawals at pharmacy counters, Venmo transactions labeled dad meds and groceries. Why couldn't I just leave? One, because I was the person who checked my father's meds at 7 in the morning and again at 9 at night. Because when my father's Parkinson's got worse, when his handwriting started to disappear and his balance gave out, he often mistook me for his wife in the middle of the night, and then apologized in a whisper I could not make sense of, because our name was on the mortgage together. The house had been my childhood home, and aside from the emotional baggage, the thought of moving my father into assisted living felt like a moral decision I could not make without crushing guilt. Because I had student loans and a car loan and a sister who had never held a regular job after college. Because leaving would mean the same. People who wanted me to pay $37,000 could make life harder for my father in retaliation. That was the power imbalance. My attachment, my history was leverage for them. At first, I tried to reason. I told my mother I could help with certain things. A contribution toward catering, a small loan for the dress if I could pay it back over 6 months. I sketched numbers. I could, realistically, arrange a one-time transfer of $2,000 and then $300 a month. She listened, and then she produced a list of comparisons. Aunt Gail had paid for her son's rehearsal dinner. Uncle Mark had covered his daughter's honeymoon. We all make sacrifices. It was less the logic of that than the tone. Sacrifices in her voice translated to a ledger where I was not an equal. The first escalation came in the form of a family meeting at the kitchen table. My sister Claire, wearing a sundress and nail polish that never lasted a week, always sat with Mum and a stack of glossy vendor pamphlets. The table had splotches of dried coffee and an ashtray Aunt Gail had thought they should throw out years ago. Mum's body language was different from how she spoke to me on the phone. With Claire, she was deferential, almost apologetic, as if she were asking permission to spend. She said, "Laura, I know you're tight, but this is for Claire. It's important." Claire smiled at me the way someone smiles when they want something and are already planning how to accept it. I said no. I gave her the math, my rent, my minimum credit card payments, my father's supplemental insurance payments, and she pinched the bridge of her nose and sighed the exact same sigh she used to use when I missed a deadline at work. And then she said, quieter this time, "Oh, you wouldn't want people to think Claire's wedding is small. You wouldn't want that." That was the first humiliation. Not the phrase itself, but the way she framed reputation as something I must buy. It was a pattern that repeated in waves. When I refused again, Mum started bringing up stories, bits of family law framed as obligations. She told me I owed them for the college tuition they had put down for me. She implied that the money was a repayment, that thousands I had paid toward groceries and car repairs were a deposit on my position in the family. She said things like, "We did it so you could be better," which read as if to say, "You were lucky, now pay the luck forward." There are small escalations that sting more because they're public. A few days later, during brunch in the kitchen with 3 cousins visiting, Mom mentioned in passing that I had been helping out. One cousin tilted her head and asked, "So, Laura, you're paying for most of the wedding?" The question landed as a public arithmetic test. I could have corrected them, explained my contribution was hypothetical, that I'd said no. But instead, I felt the room shrink on me. Claire flashed a smile I could not return. The cousin said, "Well, that's generous." And I felt generosity turning into currency. The consequence of that meeting, my social role in the family, redefined itself in their minds without my consent. The pressure turned to formal threats before long. In an emotionally brutal moment, Mum sat me down and said something she had never said before. "If you don't help, I can't promise you'll be in the will." She didn't say it like a villain. She said it like a fact. Now, she left the comment dangling, an implied revocation of future security. I realized it was the oldest trick in the book. Tell someone their future is dependent and they will make present choices to protect it. I tried a different tack. I suggested a budget change. Let's scale down the guest list. Let's use the church hall we used for Aunt Jenny's retirement party. Let's compromise. Mum cried. Claire burst into quick, shocked anger and accused me of trying to ruin her wedding. The family fractured into sides. Neighborly gossip started because someone overheard a conversation and called around. People started to ask me pointed questions at work. "Are you paying for Claire's wedding?" I would shake my head and then receive an email later that week from the mother of a bridesmaid asking whether the flowers were covered. Every question was a pressure point. When the hotel required the deposit, $10,000 up front, the family called a second, more intense meeting. Mom said she'd pay half if I would cover the rest. We argued. I handed her a list of transfers I had made over the past 3 years, printed from my bank account. The list was longer than I wanted it to be. A Venmo for $250 labeled copay, an ATM withdrawal of $600 at a pharmacy, an ACH transfer of $1,200 2 nights before a major surgery. The numbers added up. Mom looked at the printed page and then reached for my hand and said, "This is what families do. We help each other." I snapped. I told her quietly that she had not asked me to help before, that she had assumed and instructed, not asked. She leaned back in her chair and said, "You're making this about money." The line blurred. Was this about money or about respect? The consequence of that argument was isolation. Mum started excluding me from planning emails. She forwarded the vendor confirmations to Claire and Aunt Gail with no CC to me. Photos of floral arrangements showed up on the family group chat with captions like, "Can't wait." The system of inclusion became a measure of loyalty. If you were in the circle that received the updates, you were family. If you weren't, you were disposable. I recognized the pattern of manipulation, public praise for those who complied, exclusion for those who did not. I felt the slow, steady economy of affection being converted into pounds and dollars. And I thought about how carefully some people learn to weaponize love. 2 months into the wedding planning, Claire sent me a private message asking me to be in the wedding party. It would mean the world. The message was a curated sadness. It used phrases like, "We've always been close," and "family first." I replied that I couldn't be a bridesmaid if I wasn't contributing to the budget and that I wanted the truth. Was the demand coming from Claire or from Mum? She answered in 2 sentences. "It's Mum. She's stressed. If you love me, you'll help." The language was direct and clean. That is pressure with a face. The consequence was that my refusal became a moral failing in Claire's mind. She stopped answering my calls for days. I started to document everything. I printed bank statements. I saved text messages. I wrote down dates and amounts like a forensic accountant of hurt. It felt strange at first. I was always the person who believed things through conversation, not through lists, but the family had turned my life into numbers. It made sense then to respond with numbers of my own. The next wave of escalation was fiscal and humiliating. Mom started calling my employer to check in on me, making small talk that had a hard edge. A neighbor called to tell me she had seen my mother in a bank parking lot with Claire and a vendor. Rumors swirled. The family started to hint that I had an obligation because of what they had done for me. And they would repeat those hints until the obligation looked inevitable. People who had not said a word before knew things about my finances. The consequence was that in my community, generosity and indebtedness had tangled into an ugly knot, and I could not get them apart. Aside from the emotional tactics, they used leverage. They threatened to change the locks on the house. It's legally complicated. My father's name was on the deed, and Mom had control over the checkbook. But the threat was more symbolic than actual. Imagine being told in the winter that you might have to find somewhere else to sleep. That possibility sliced away at the options I had left. It was intended to hurry me into making a payment I could not responsibly make. In the middle of those weeks, I did a thing that felt both childish and necessary. I drafted an invoice. The invoice was not a threat. It had a header with my name and address, a date, April 12th, 2024, and an itemized list. It included unreimbursed household contributions, 2021 to 2024, $21,600. Medical copays and supplies paid for Dad, $6,400. Emergency heating oil, winter 2022, $900. Internet, utilities, and miscellaneous household expenses, $3,100. Emotional labor and coordination, a line I almost deleted because it felt silly to bill for being dependable, $2,000. Reimbursement requested toward wedding costs, if family insists on asking me to fund, $3,500. Total requested $37,500. I numbered the invoice, included bank details, and wrote in a small font at the bottom, payment terms, net 30. Please remit to avoid further action. The phrasing felt absurd, like something a small business owner would send to a customer who refused to pay for services. But I was tired of being asked to pay for love without paperwork. I sent it by email to Mom and Claire at 9:13 p.m. Seed, Aunt Gail. The reaction was instantaneous and violent in its own way. Mom texted me profanity. Claire emailed me a string of messages that mercifully I only read once, late at night. Accusations of greed, of betrayal, of humiliation. The family group chat filled with forwarded messages from relatives who wanted to know where I had learned such business-like behavior. Some wrote that I was ungrateful, some that I was cruel. Aunt Gail called me to ask if I was okay, and her voice was small. Then the house turned colder. I did the dishes, and my father didn't look up from his paper. He didn't say anything about the invoice. I realized that by giving the invoice a formal shape, I had turned the whole dynamic into a ledger that could be read back at me. If you invoice someone, you constitute a debt, but you also change the terms of what counts as a favor. The consequence of the invoice was immediate social exile. For 2 weeks, I ate at my desk at work and slept on the couch at home because the guest bedroom had been readied for out-of-town relatives and now felt like a showroom for people who had decided I was the villain. Claire unfriended me on social platforms. Mom called me a variety of names and then sent over a list of items I supposedly owed them, emailed receipts attached, as if pointing to the same ledger would prove my debt. She accused me of trying to score points and of weaponizing money I had no right to call mine. You always made everything about yourself, she wrote in a note she left on the refrigerator. There was a low point, a quiet collapse that lasted 3 days. Dad had a bad night, an episode where his tremors were worse, where he could not speak clearly for a long stretch. The doctor adjusted his medication, and I stayed up in the hospital waiting area while Claire and Mom took comfort in the same room, hands clasped, whispering about centerpieces and timelines like people who are frightened of doing something practical. The smell of antiseptic and the soft rubber soles of my shoes on linoleum felt like a thin membrane between me and everything else. After we returned home, the first thing Mum did was change the Wi-Fi password and tell me, over coffee, that she needed to look into practical arrangements if I wasn't going to step up. She said it with a softness that made up for nothing. That night, feeling small and abandoned, I packed a duffel bag. I did not have a plan beyond sleeping at the apartment of a coworker who had offered in passing. I felt like I had lost leverage, the house, the social standing, the family warmth. I sat on the stoop of my childhood home until dawn, the bag beside me, the invoice like a flat stone in my pocket. I had one leverage point left: evidence. I had a list of bank transfers. I had texts in which my mother had explicitly asked for money and in which Claire had said things that could be taken as requests. The world tends to prefer documents to memories. I took the printed bank statements and the email threads and went to a small community legal clinic that offered pro bono consultations. The woman who met me was patient. She said what I knew in a different register. Texts promising repayment could be used as evidence in small claims court, as could bank transfers that matched those texts. She suggested something I would not have thought of: send a formal demand letter. Put the invoice in more official language and say this is the last attempt before filing suit. The demand letter was not a magic wand. It was a bureaucratic step. But it had the virtue of converting feelings into procedure. I did it. I had the clinic notarize the demand letter, and I sent it by certified mail on May 2nd, 2024. I also emailed the PDF to Mom with a short message. I asked for a discussion. I have documented my expenses. If we can't resolve this, I will file in small claims. The response was cruelly anticlimactic. My mother posted a screenshot of the demand letter to a private family Facebook group. Only 72 members, mostly second cousins and neighbours, under the caption, "Can you believe this?" Some sided with me privately, some did not. The outrage spun. My circle at work reduced an awkwardly small number of sympathisers who offered coffee and listened politely. Claire called me once. We talked in clipped sentences and then she hung up. If the demand letter was a pebble thrown into the pond, what changed was not immediate. It was, instead, a mistake that came 3 weeks later like a sliding door. Mum had been emailing Claire a series of scanned receipts from the bank to prove that they did not have the money for me to hand over. She meant to send them privately, an act to bolster her argument publicly, but she misaddressed the email and sent it to me and to a thread that included the family lawyer she had spoken to in the past. The subject line read, "Final transfers, Claire Wedding, posted April 29th. Attached was a PDF of bank transactions, an outgoing wire of $14,500 to the venue, an ACH deposit of $9,500 to the catering company, a $3,200 card charge at a bridal boutique, a $600 transfer to a photographer. The dates matched the vendor contracts. The total matched the initial number my mother had claimed was too much. She thought she was proving she didn't have the funds to ask me to pay. Instead, the document proved something else, that she had arranged for funds to be paid from the family account and that the decision to ask me for the remainder had been a choice, not a necessity. The document also contained an email thread in which Mom had written to Claire, "Don't worry, I covered the big items. We'll ask Laura for small stuff. She won't say no when her back is against the wall." The email read like a confession in plain text. I stared at the PDF until my eyes burned. The missent email was not a melodramatic confession. No villain laughed, no lights dimmed. But it was a mistake that unmade the illusion that Mum had been asking me out of need. Suddenly, the ledger was not just emotional extortion, It was a set of choices someone else had made. This was the turning point. No speeches, no sudden catharsis, just a factual change. The power dynamic shifted because the facts supported me. When you can show the bank receipt and the direct message in which one person admits strategy, you can stop being gaslit into thinking you are the unreasonable one. I printed the missent email and the bank PDF and went back to the legal clinic. The attorney, who'd helped me before, looked at the documents and said, "You have evidence of a plan to ask you to cover costs even though funds were available." She suggested a course of action, mediation, and if mediation failed, small claims, with the possibility of seeking restitution for the documented expenses I had paid. It was not dramatic, and it was paperwork, but for the first time, I had a plausible pathway. Mediation was scheduled in June. We met in a community centre conference room with a neutral mediator and 2 chairs on either side of a folding table. Mum arrived with a plastic folder of her own. Claire came later, hair done in an expensive way their vendor recommended. For the first time since the invoice, the conversation moved beyond accusation and into numbers. The mediator asked what we wanted. Mum said she wanted peace and Claire's wedding to happen without my continued obstruction. I said, simply, I wanted reimbursement for specific documented expenses and an agreement about future financial expectations. No more demands without consent, no more surprise, contingency items. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. The room was full of the small, factual piles of paperwork I had brought. The mediator suggested a settlement. Mum could reimburse me for half of the documented household contributions, $10,800, paid over 6 months, and Claire would cover the $3,500 line item on the invoice I had listed as reimbursement for the wedding contribution. Mum would also sign a short statement acknowledging that future financial requests had to be discussed with me. I thought about pushing for more. I thought about all the nights I had sat up with Dad, about the time I had missed a promotion because I was the only one who could coordinate family logistics. But I remembered the winter on the stoop, the way leverage had felt like cold metal against my spine. I accepted the settlement. It was not a victory in the cinematic sense. There were no triumphant chords, but the mediation document was typed in plain language and signed. The first payment showed up 2 weeks later in my account, $1,800 direct deposit. It felt like a heavy coin dropped into a jar after an argument. The consequence of the turning point and the mediation was a slow, meticulous reordering of our relationships. Claire went ahead with her wedding. It was not a lavish party by the standards of the very wealthy, but it had the vendor contracts Mom had paid for. Claire's married life started with a kind of awkwardness that I could see in photographs. Smiles that did not quite reach the eyes. A wedding present that arrived late. The family did not collapse into ruin, and there was no explosive confrontation. Life rearranged itself into a new, less complacent pattern. Mom and I spoke less often. She called when she needed medical paperwork signed. I called when I needed to check on Dad. We were efficient. The intimacy that had once defined our relationship was now separate from transactions. There were losses. I lost the easy illusion that love in my family was unconditional. I lost the automatic expectation that my labor would be taken for granted. The house felt different. My father called me sometimes, and asked for music he liked when he was younger, and I played it for him. I moved out in September and signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment 2 miles from the house. The rent was tight. I adjusted my spending. I kept a line in my budget that said emergency fund and treated it like an altar. There were also pragmatic consequences. The 6-month repayment plan completed in April of the following year. Now, the last deposit felt strange, an end to a ledger and the start of another. I had a modest savings cushion to fall back on and a clearer sense of when I was owed consideration and when I owed it. Claire and I never returned to how we had been. Sometimes she called on birthdays. Sometimes we sent each other texts with pictures of things like sunsets or a dog that reminded one of us of a childhood pet. It was a relationship with a thinner veneer, but a more durable honesty. I do not tell the story because I believe invoices are a moral cure-all. They are not. But the invoice and the misdirected email that followed served a function. They converted years of unspoken expectations into something that could be examined. To me, that was the point. Power in family often lives in the unspoken. Give it a name and you change it. The ending is not tidy. I still take Dad to appointments. I still sometimes wish for a version of my childhood where love and money and duty were not entangled. I also, for the first time in a long time, sleep through the night without listening for the clatter of someone else's needs. I learned that boundaries can be written in ink and enforced as calmly as any legal document. You can ask for respect in the same way you ask for payment, and sometimes the response is to be excluded. But sometimes it is to negotiate honestly. I made a choice that kept my father at home and also preserved a sliver of my future. If you've watched this far and this story resonated with you, even if it makes you uncomfortable, leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe. And if you have a moment, I'd like to know, what would you have done if you were in my shoes?